All right, we're recording a little bit late this week, but that's more than okay. We're back with the next episode of Talkin Thrones, Season 5, Episode 3, entitled High Sparrow. And this is where we're getting into some of my more, let's call it confused elements, because it's like, there's a thing that I want to get into specifically with this episode where I'm not quite sure if I love it or hate it, but we'll get into that. We got the introduction to some very, very important characters in this episode. Pat, what do you have to say before we get into this episode?
Listen, all I'm thinking is that the Talking TV family, here, watching or listening to Talking Thrones, really thinks the High Sparrow should have been cast as Snoop Dogg for Sizzle. Okay.
Oh my God.
I think that would have been a whole different show, and it would have been much, much better.
Oh man, you and your 90s hip hop references, they never get old. All of that and more on tonight's episode of Talking Thrones. All right, Pat, we got a pretty crucially important episode. Like I said, Season 5, Episode 3, entitled High Sparrow. This is another one, like I said, we're in the back half. We're in the background of the show now. This is another episode that introduces us to a couple more firsts, a couple things that would kind of gear us towards the trajectory of the rest of the show. Obviously, as is in the title, we get the introduction of the titular High Sparrow, portrayed brilliantly by Jonathan Pryce. I want to get into him. There's also, after Michael Slovis directed the first 2 episodes of this season, this episode is directed by the first of 3 directors that Benioff and Weiss brought on this season that would be there until the end of the show, that being Mark Mylod. Mark Mylod directed this episode and the next episode. He also directed episodes 7 and 8, kind of saw the reintroduction of the Hound back into the course of the show next season, as well as directing some pretty big episodes in season 7. The other 2 directors that came on, of course, being Jeremy Podeswa and Miguel Sapochnik. All 3 of these guys obviously had such a huge, influence both over this show and the rest of the HBO shows that they directed. That Miguel Sapochnik is obviously the guy that is co-show running the House of the Dragon spinoff, which just recently got its release date as well. House of the Dragon will officially premiere Sunday, August 21st. That will be the first official release date for the first Game of Thrones spinoff in 3 years, in the 3 years since the show's initial run. But Pat, so we've got the introduction of this crucially important character who kind of, in a way, like, is the deciding factor in big part of the storylines that are going to come in the next 2 seasons. You obviously having no connection to the book really and having no emotional connection to this character. What are your thoughts kind of in hindsight on the High Sparrow? Some regard him as pretty cool, late to the game antagonist. Some say that he's a little bit, he became almost like too little too late and didn't really get a chance to shine. I don't know. What are your thoughts on the High Sparrow as a character?
I don't know. I don't necessarily like the storyline completely. I think it's one of those things where in King's Landing, you needed the characters to basically deal with something. And that's what the character comes across as. Like the High Sparrow shows up and, Cersei sort of invites him in. And, and I love the line where it's like, Tywin would have never let this happen. And there's less of that connection between what Tywin would have done and what Cersei decides and is trying to do by basically empowering the High Sparrow. It kind of just falls into a rut, where it's like, they're religious zealots and it backfires. And, throughout the course of the storyline, it just sort of seems, it's like, we're just going to punish these people and they deserve punishing. And, it's really, in my opinion, a little bit of a forced storyline. That's really just, you need to give Margaery and Cersei feel for their battle and hatred against each other, but also you need to sort of like keep them apart and keep it sort of evolving over a season or 2. And so I don't necessarily think I love the storyline. I think there's some cool key moments that do develop in the show, but overall, it sort of just felt like King's Landing needed, to spin the plate. Why, Jon is dealing with stuff in the north and Daenerys is dealing with stuff in Essos. And, it just sort of, it's not bad, but overall, it kind of just meanders.
Yeah, it's so weird because the High Sparrow storyline kind of, again, it's to me the prime focus of what they were attempting to accomplish with seasons 5 and 6, which we obviously know were the seasons where they kind of had to transition us into this new phase of the show, as far as, kind of really us surpassing the books. We're into books 4 and 5 by this point. And like I said in the first episode of the show, books 4 and 5 really sought to establish that kind of all the commoners that have been afflicted by, and whose lives have been completely upended and destroyed by the frequent constant warring that had happened throughout the last couple of seasons. This was kind of them getting back at them. This was all of the sins coming home to roost, both for Cersei and unintentionally for Daenerys as well. How essentially you were going to have the common folk hold the High Lords to their task, and you see that all around this season as well. You see that with Cersei, obviously you see that with Daenerys, you see that with Jon, with his inheriting of the Night's Watch as well. And I guess kind of my confusion with it, because this enters like a very, very confusing territory, is this was probably the last time that Benioff and Weiss actually tried to say something bigger with the storylines, as far as it's as far as its connection to abuse of power and obviously karma and justice and all that, where again the majority of this story for so long had been about the good guys seemingly not understanding the world that it is they lived in, and as a result consistently seeing being punished for that. And now we finally start to see this turnaround where you have these characters come in to hold the bad guys to task, because again it's kind of the from the area that they were kind of just completely disregarding and never really taken seriously to begin with, And so you have kind of this fledgling of an idea here, but it's ultimately kind of weighed down by, like you said, the fact that this character, I think, starts off as a pretty compelling character. When we first meet him in this episode, he's very calm, he's very serene, he's kind of going out of his way to be selfless. He's serving soup, he's got this little stand where he's serving soup to all the disenfranchised and everything. Only for it to become kind of, I just don't think that the twist as far as, okay, Cersei kind of elevating him so that he can ultimately serve her interests, and then him turning around and ultimately, betraying her and kind of seizing control and command, and ultimately, manipulating Tommen as their puppet. To me, this should have been the first inkling of a typical, kind of Benioff and Weiss storyline post the book adapted seasons, which is that all the inklings of the idea are there, but it's not really executed to its full vision. Because essentially, I guess if I can point out the differences, if we can get into kind of the stories as far as how it goes, is the big difference that I found between the portrayal of the High Sparrow in the show versus the books is that in the books, once again, Cersei is portrayed as kind of a raving lunatic, since this is really the first time that we see a perspective chapter from her viewpoint. So it's the first time that we really get to know her and understand what she's thinking, which is something that we've really never gotten with her beforehand. And so as a result, she's portrayed as kind of this raving lunatic who doesn't really know what she's doing, is making a series of bad decisions, surrounding herself with a bunch of yes men who have no idea what they're doing. I think there's even a joke where one of the people who she appoints to the small council is a dude who literally can't stop coughing for 3 seconds and is literally on his deathbed because of whatever the version of tuberculosis was at the time. And it's to the point where it's the fact that she's allowing the sparrows to kind of gain control is very much portrayed as a bad and stupid decision. And the problem that comes with its portrayal in the show is that it's very clearly a kind of from a common sense standpoint, it's very clearly a bad idea. It's so you're going to take this group of religious fanatics who sort of kind of you think you can manipulate just because you're feeling outdone by Margaery, and you're going to elevate them to this position. And Cersei, whether it's because just of how brilliantly Lena Headey portrays it, or just for the fact that for the most part we really haven't seen her prove to be this incompetent yet, you almost seem like she thinks that this is a good idea, but you almost are intended to buy into it and go along with her, if only for the purposes of setting up the twist that the High Sparrow is ultimately going to betray her. It feels like it's building up to a twist that doesn't really need to be there, if that makes any sense, because the whole thing is it should have been obvious from minute one, very, very similar to how Ned should very easily obviously have not have trusted Littlefinger and all the people, because again, to me, the Cersei Lannister arc this season is very much a reflection of the Ned Stark arc, where she's making all the same mistakes that Ned did this time around. But the only difference being is that unlike season 1, where it's very clear that Ned did not know what he was doing and then as a result was punished for his lack of knowledge, we're almost supposed to go along and think, oh, Cersei knows exactly what she's doing with the recruiting of the sparrows in kind of into her cause in kind of her political game that she's playing with Margaery. But then we're supposed to be surprised at the end when they ultimately betray her and be like, oh, no, so you literally invited us in and now we're going to take over. Like I guess that's where like my conundrum comes from, because it's not a bad idea in concept, but with how it's executed, once again, I hate to be a broken record here, but versus how it's portrayed in the books, it doesn't feel like it's fully fleshed out or.
Yeah, I just think with the whole entire storyline, they really don't set up the High Sparrow as being sort of, so much of a fanatic, like
Right. He seems just
obviously
like a regular guy when you first meet him.
exactly, and that's exactly what he is a fanatic. And if you're in the leadership position in this time period, like you're not necessarily going to empower extremists that could potentially go against you. And I also think one of the weird things about the show is that, for the most part, religion has been there. It's like, obviously we have Melisandre and, the god of light, and we have the old gods, and we have all this stuff. But like in King's Landing, there hasn't been really that much talk of religion.
Right.
It's been one of those things that's sort of, brushed to the side. And, quickly in this episode, they have, what is it? The High Scepter.
Yeah, the High Scepter.
He's in Littlefinger's old establishment, basically a facsimile of, run by someone else. And, basically the sparrows come in and, punish him for his crime, which is not really, maintaining the faith and just indulging in some human vices. And, it's one of those things where Cersei just casually, yeah, you're right. I put him in prison and now there's an opportunity for you. And it's one of those things where I guess there's not really too much of a setup in terms of
Right.
how much power
Right.
religion plays in this. It's almost like the crown has absolute control over religion, but somehow when, Cersei puts the High Sparrow in power, he's able to usurp things. Just a snap of a finger. It's
Right.
like, okay, here's a scene, and somehow he has this magical power where he's able to throw people in prison.
Well, I'll tell you what
And
it is. It's because the problem comes from we're supposed to be, and this is what and I'll give this episode credit for this. It very much tries with this setup where we're led to believe that because Cersei is immediately able to sense how Margaery, as we see in the beginning of the episode, is already starting to get into and start to manipulate Tommen for her own advantage. She is already, and combined with Kevin basically saying to her face that he was not going to help her in any way, shape, or form, she definitely feels kind of very outgunned. And it feels like she's trying to do this because she kind of needs somebody in her corner. Because so it very much feels like a move made out of desperation, which is kind of in a way the same thing that was motivating her in the last one. But I guess the difference being that she doesn't really have anything to worry about. But also it's the fact that Jaime already warned her about this, that this was a thing. And if he did, shouldn't she be making or trying to recruit other, like, she's still Cersei Lannister. She still has like the entire Lannister army. Why is she pretending? She was literally threatening Littlefinger with Lannister soldiers not even a couple seasons ago. Why does she feel the need to seemingly surround herself with like religious fanatics that literally just took down the High Septon? Like that's the thing that like really doesn't connect for me.
yeah, but the High Septon didn't even need to be taken down.
Right.
That's basically Cersei's the one that did that. And, it kind of like, why? You could have
Right.
just basically squeezed more control over the High Septon and be like, hey, you just can't, be vulnerable to these fanatics. So it's one of those things where, I don't know, it's the storyline's kind of muddled. It's understandable. Like I understand, like, the end goals, the ends justify the means. Because it's like what happens during Loras's trial, is amazing. And the fact that Cersei comes back and sort of,
Right.
has the ultimate revenge at that point, even though she's been through a lot, it's kind of like bittersweet. It's a great moment in the show, but there's so many other things that she could have done to really combat Margaery. And, it's like I said, it's kind of like they're just sort of spinning the King's Landing plate and having drama and dealing with this triangle between Tommen, Margaery, and Cersei, and it kind of it's I don't know. It's not as developed as it could have been. Like Margaery is sort of always reacting. She's defending Loras. She's defending herself. There's she's not really on the attack as much as she could have been. So there's something weird about the storyline that's kind of just like a placeholder in my mind.
Right.
It's not bad material.
Right. But it
A
definitely
lot
makes
of good
it seem
things
like
happen. But
it definitely makes it seem like 5 and 6 much more are really just a placeholder in order to like kind of tide us over until the last 2 seasons. Like it definitely feels like after a certain point, like after season 4, they probably could have all just like combined all of the storylines into like really like just 2 seasons, that we could have gotten to the White Walker thing a lot quicker. But because there were already so many characters and storylines, and this is a problem that I have with George R.R. Martin too, because Martin deliberately very much took his time with the rest of the characters and where they were going to go, and really, really took his time with getting them to their final destination after the events of the Red Wedding. And so that's kind of part of the reason why we have to go with it. But that brings me to my next point about this episode overall, which is that I have this written down, which is this is really confusing because this episode it's another setup episode. We're 3 episodes in, but this is still setting up because, like I said, season 5 is not only setting up for the events of the next season, but also really for the next couple of seasons, all the way up into the finale. And the confusing thing that I have with this episode specifically is this episode is setting up for so many of the storylines that we're going to get in the next couple of episodes, and it's doing such a good job, like for all the moments, like setting up Jon to be eventually becoming King of the North, setting up Brienne to eventually kill Stannis, setting up Cersei for the Sparrow betrayal, setting up obviously Arya and everything that she's gonna, all of her conflicts between, having to choose between the House of Black and White versus, her allegiance to House Stark. And so all of that is amazingly well set up in this episode. The problem is knowing the outcomes of all those storylines in hindsight, and a majority of them ending really, really badly or stupidly. I think the only one of those outcomes that pretty much works almost without any hitches, but it's kind of ruined by what comes after it, is Jon eventually becoming King of the North. But every one of those other storylines, like Arya's resolution with the House of Black and White, Cersei, not with how she deals with the Sparrows afterwards, but Cersei with the betrayal from the Sparrows, Brienne killing Stannis. Like I said, pretty much everything that I just listed there. So many of those storylines end so haphazardly, so half-baked, and so stupidly that it really does kind of wreck this episode and kind of make it like kind of a little bit worse in hindsight, even though it's doing such a great job with the setup. And that kind of brings me to my next point, which is, the House of Black and White. We actually, after kind of wasting time with Arya just wandering around Braavos in the last episode, we actually get to see the inside of the House in Black and White. And I gotta say, as far as capturing, like, kind of, what my thought process of it would be, I always kind of likened the House of Black and White very much to, the House of the Undying and Karth way back when in season 2. I think they did a pretty spanking good job. Like, it's kind of like this big cavernous thing. It feels both kind of intimate, but also scary and mysterious at the same time. You have all the different sigmas that, all the different, relics and oaths, all the different religions there. You've got the giant pool there and all that. And I think that, again, all this stuff, it's really, really well set up as far as, starting to establish Arya and her conflict that she's going to have, which is kind of maintaining her allegiance to her, being a Stark and a family versus truly becoming no one. And I think that still for the time period, this season, I think does a pretty good job of that, because but the problem that I have comes from the fact that for the most part, it's funny because it took me a long time to realize what my problem with the House of Black and White in the show was. And I finally realized it, which is that at the end of the day, the whole thing is that the House of Black and White in the books made it clear to Arya that if she wanted to do this, she had to truly become no one. And I guess the difference being is that Arya wasn't necessarily fighting it as much, but the difference being is that in the books, Arya was punished for her blindness because she legitimately made a mistake, because she did kill someone that she wasn't supposed to, but she killed him not for something really personally tied to her, but personally tied to almost her family, which is where in the books, the person who Arya kills instead of Meryn Trant is a Night's Watch brother, ironically enough tied to Sam, which I'll get to that. And, once we, cover Sam's traveling south to Old Town arc in season 6, she killed the Night's Watch brother that was traveling with Sam because he was planning on deserting the Night's Watch and just staying in Braavos. So she killed him for breaking his vow. So, but because of that, she still killed someone that she wasn't supposed to kill, but there was like no personal attachment there. So there is this idea that Arya is still choosing the House of Black and White. But here, I guess the problem is that they're kind of in the same way doing the same thing that the Jedi Knights did in the Star Wars prequels, and that they're supposed to be very cold, very emotionless. You're not supposed to have any attachment, anything. And like, it would have been one thing if Arya, it would have been one thing if like, I don't know. I have a big problem with that and how it's portrayed in media, because it to me, it's like kind of so cold and antithetical, and it usually doesn't result in any like rich character or arc. The other problem too that I have is this introduces probably the worst character on the entire show of Game of Thrones, that being the waif, who is literally a character that is only there to provide kind of like the Stephen King bully character, but she's supposed to be like shrouded in the idea of, oh, she's supposed to be the antagonistic figure that is supposed to, you know, push against Arya. She's essentially supposed to be the Alistair Thorne of the House of Black and White in order to push against Arya, but her purpose, she ultimately serves no purpose other than to just be like somebody that is mad at Arya for reasons. I don't know, Pat, what's your take on the whole House of Black and White and the waif thing?
Yeah, you've been going on a tear here.
A little bit.
You know, I'm trying to think, because you make up, you're at least telling a story that I can listen to and sort of appreciate. But the main thing, like from this episode, the two things that I get is like, she's supposed to do boring routine tasks until she fades into the background.
Right.
And that's what she's being trained to do.
Right.
And then the other thing is the waif sort of starts, you know, questioning her, who are you? And she says, oh, I'm nobody. And it's like, oh, I don't believe you.
Right.
And slaps, you know, just slaps her over and over and over again. And the fact is, it's about a mentality. It's about a way of living, you know, and that's sort of the interesting part about the storyline is like, Arya is used to being Arya Stark, but now she has to live in a completely different way where she forgets that and kind of gets rid of that and becomes someone new. And it's one of those things where this storyline, in terms of the way it ends, you know, she sort of tricks the waif, and we don't really, you know, it's kind of like Brienne and Stannis, right?
Right.
You know, we're supposed to believe that she killed him, but you could also believe that she didn't. And the same thing with the waif, right? You know, the storyline ends with Arya killing the waif, but in essence, you know, maybe the waif just took over Arya's persona.
Right.
You know, and so it's one of those things where there's not a clarity at the end of the tunnel for these storylines. They're sort of ambiguous, and they just, you know, again, like with the High Sparrow, it feels like it's spinning the plate in King's Landing. And, you know, here in Bravos, it feels like it's spinning the plate with Arya. And, you know, I think it goes to what we said before is like, this is the part where the writing up until this point has been really solid and been leading somewhere, and everything sort of has like a setup and a payoff. And now we're leading into an area where it's like things are happening, and they lead up into these like iconic moments. Like I think Hard Home is one of the best episodes that we're going to get this season.
Absolutely. It's one of the best episodes of the entire show to me.
Exactly. And I think some of the other people are disappointed by it. You know, like I think I
get where they're coming from as far as
articles and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But
I get where they're coming from with the first half. Yeah. But that's just a huge pet peeve that I have with a lot of stuff that Benioff and Weiss specifically put into these last couple seasons, which is where they have moments where they're sort of trying to be ambiguous, but then they just tell you straight up what happened afterwards. It's like, okay, well, why did you need to be ambiguous in the moment? Like Brienne killing Stannis, the Blackfish off-screen death, the Arya thing. It's like, a big problem that I have in media is when people are trying to be ambiguous just for the sake of being ambiguous. It's like, okay, if the whole point of being ambiguous is to leave us thinking and questioning it, why are you going to set us up with something that's ambiguous and then just tell us it after the fact? If like, no, if you're going to tell us it, just show it to us.
I think it's a good sign of like, you know, they're leaving the door open for other storylines to happen, and then
and they don't happen. So
yeah, but then they make a decision to go a different direction, you know, and so I think that's, you know, as a creator, you know, you're giving yourself opportunities. So I understand that, you know, but ultimately,
I don't know. I guess that's just the difference between you and me. Because my whole thing, I'm sorry, even if you're a creator, I'm like, look, pick a decision, stick with it. You know, that's always my whole
ultimately,
thing.
I think we moved away from like very intricate writing and we're moving into basically the big payoffs, the big moments.
Right, 100%. But then
the
they're still trying.
battles,
But then they're still trying to have those intricate moments there, and it's like you can't have it both ways. You just can't. You can't be like, oh, we're gonna have a setup for something that comes later, but we're trying to wrap everything up. So it's like you can't have it both ways. You just can't. That like I guess that's my problem. Is they're like these last 4 seasons for me are the ultimate example of a show trying to have its cake and eating it too, and it doesn't work most of the time. It really, really does not. Next, moving.
Like ultimately, I'll say that I think the show in the second half is not as tight as the first half. Like I think pretty much if you're a fan of the show, the first half is just really has you from start to finish. Like everything just seems perfect and put together. And I think the second half is more about these big moments where you're willing to put up with some of these other scenes, some that you like, some that you actually detest. And then you get these great scenes and you're just like, oh man, that's why I'm still watching the show.
Yeah.
Hard Home's why I'm still watching the show.
Yeah.
Battle of the Bastards is still why I'm watching the show. Hey, I think The Long Night, although it came
I love The Long Night. I love The Long Night. I will say that.
Yeah, it came too early in that season. Like, I think, it should have been sort of like, almost the penultimate episode, like, deal with the Night King after, Daenerys has gone crazy. So you could talk about the writing of that final season and just say, like, was Daenerys really the final bad guy or was the Night King the final bad guy? It's one of those things where, it's just about having these big moments, and to the writers, maybe they either missed the boat on terms of how to properly write the show, or they just sort of, had these grand ideas and like, let's just have this great moment with the Night King and the Long Night. Yeah. Let's just have this
became
great,
about the moments, not the moments in between the moments, which is what the show was all about for the first 4 seasons.
Yeah, but maybe once they had you hooked, it gave them the opportunity to
but I also called bullshit on that only because we also know at this time when they were shooting 5 and 6, 2015 and 16 was when they were starting to hear out the offers from Disney and Netflix about Star Wars and their own show that they could potentially do, and then other HBO shows that they were going to do outside of Game of Thrones. So that's the only reason why I say it's like, okay, that's kind of where their thought process was there, and the only reason why I say that is because they've been so vocal in public about all their offers that they were receiving at the time and why they were just the gusto that they had for those first 4 seasons was just not there for the last 4. But
I think it's one of those things where every TV show has to have a peak. And every TV show has to jump the shark, as Happy Days literally did. So
I guess, but it's like, I guess just my whole thought process on that is like, we're already post Sopranos and Breaking Bad, and both of those shows prove that shows don't have to have those. They don't have to have the jumping the shark or the throwing off.
I think Breaking Bad, it has its jumping shark moment. I
disagree. I think Breaking Bad naturally builds to each one of its moments, and every.
No, I think the whole fumigating half of the season where his new enemy becomes this like what the was it the neo-Nazi gang guy. That whole thing is just really, to me, dragged out that series.
Oh, really?
Yeah, no, 100%. I didn't like that bad guy. I didn't like that antagonist.
That's crazy because that's only the last season. So
yeah, no, that's I think.
They did that thing where they split. They did that thing where they split the
season
season into 2 parts. Yeah.
Yeah, the first half of the last season is Walter versus Hank, and I thought that was brilliant.
No, that's the second half. That's the second half.
No, that's the first half, and then
that is the second half. Trust me, Hank does not find out about Walt as Heisenberg until the last episode of the first half of that first batch of 8.
Yeah, but the thing is, like, Hank is killed by this, right? But then you're not. But then there's only 2 episodes left of the show. No, I think there's a couple more.
There are 2 episodes left. Hank dies at the beginning of episode 6 of that season, and then there's only 2 more episodes after that, and then it's done. That's the finale.
Yeah, it's once Hank is out of the picture, that show to me was done.
It's over, yeah, because it's over. Then they only have the 2 episodes left to
Yeah,
wrap it up.
but that antagonist was just not exciting at all.
Well, I guess, but that guy wasn't
you know,
even that guy really wasn't even an antagonist. That guy was just kind of a non sequitur. But speaking of
yeah,
which, we've got
whatever.
we've got way off point. But
the fact is, like, every show sort of has its core, and then it goes into a different state. And
I
and
guess
think,
if we're gonna compare Breaking Bad to Game of Thrones, is that Game of Thrones, after they kind of had their red wedding moment, which was Gus's death, they at the very least knew, okay, we're only gonna have one more season, and it ended up getting split into 2 parts. Game of Thrones had 4 more seasons after that, so I guess that was the big difference there. But
yeah, I think season 4 is the last, like,
truly great
100% concrete season.
Yes.
And then season 5, which is I think is part of your theory, is essentially you start seeing the cracks in the foundation.
Yeah. And like I said, I noticed them. This is not a new, but keep in mind, this is not a new theory of mine. I've had this since 2015 when I started watching this season, and I saw that they were combining Feast for Crows and Dance with Dragons into one season. And I'm like, okay, there's no shot they're going to be able to hit everything. And even more than that, especially after how they did Dorne, I'm like, okay, something's not right, But like I said, we still had 3 more seasons of the show. I still had yet to see what was actually going to come. But in hindsight, it's like,
this is almost like the anime thing, right? Where the manga comes out, and halfway through the manga, they start doing the animated series. And so therefore, like, they outpace the manga and they do their own thing, and then all of a sudden the manga finishes, and then they just redo the entire anime series.
Yeah, but the difference being is that at the very least, they finished the manga.
Well, I'm thinking like Full Metal Alchemist, like that second version, Brotherhood, was fantastic. Even though I love the first version of Full Metal Alchemist, the Brotherhood just really nails it in every aspect of it. And the fact is, like, Game of Thrones, like, George R. Martin, I think for the most part, he's happy with his role of sort of
Don't get me started.
Pushing forward the sequels, writing video games or whatever the case may be. Like, listen, like, I think the man is thinking about his estate, and he's thinking about, like, what's the most valuable thing for his legacy, after hopefully many years yet, he passes away. I think he's really thinking about that, and it's his main core books. It's like someone will finish them someday. I don't think it needs to be him. Ultimately, he's generating a world that people can enjoy, that fans can be a part of. And, he's kind of set the foundation, and, his sort of, legacy is, hey, have fun, create more stories in this world. He doesn't need to, basically focus it. He just really needs to make it as expansive as possible. And I think that's really what he's focused on. And, listen, this show here is still fantastic. I think it's still worth watching from start to finish. We're talking more on like a very like connected fan way, where it's like, hey, the first couple seasons really fantastic. Second season started disappointing us, but overall, like, it's still a good show from start to finish.
Oh, for sure. And that's the thing. And that's the other thing I don't want people to get the wrong idea about is if anything, I'm complaining so much because I love this show so much. Even the bad season, even the bad seasons of this show are still light years better than a majority of other like bad seasons.
You want it to be perfect.
And but I want it to be perfect.
That's what's coming out as
exactly. I want it to be perfect. I'm sorry. After the first 4 seasons were so good, I want it to be perfect. Who's not perfect, by the way, who really starts fucking up, I think even more so than Cersei Lannister in this episode, because this is just the episode. I feel like the subtitle of this episode should just be characters when they start fucking up. That's Littlefinger. Because of course the other thing that happens in this episode is when Littlefinger officially hands Sansa over to the Boltons, and once again, peak acting from Sophie Turner. Like, just every time she like kind of like starts freaking out and like starts reflecting like the PTSD that she suffered over the last couple of years from King's Landing, it's absolutely masterful to me. But I mean, again, there are holes here, obviously, because of the fact that Sansa is clearly the substitute for the Jane Poole character. In the books, it's the Lannisters as part of the solidifying their deal with the Bolton. They send Jane Poole north to marry Ramsay, masquerading her off as Arya Stark, and she's the one that Theon ends up saving and rescuing after Ramsay has had his way with her. But obviously in the show, it's Sansa because they needed a character that people are familiar with, and so that was fine and all. But I guess my problem comes to the fact of it's like, okay, so this is once again, kind of a problem that I have with overall just Littlefinger's portrayal in the show. And this is where they really started to rear their ugly head. And Martin has commented on this. This is a problem that he had with the initial portrayal of Littlefinger, but then kind of like, as time went on, obviously he ended up on the moot point over it. But this is where I started to have a problem with it, which is where the whole emphasis on Littlefinger is that it's okay, nobody likes Littlefinger, nobody really trusts Littlefinger, nobody takes him seriously though, and they all kind of keep him around because he's advantageous to them. He's very rich, he kind of gets things done, he's this guy who knows everybody, but he also isn't really tied to any sort of big faction, so he doesn't really have any sort of leverage, which you think would make him super dangerous and untrustworthy, but instead everyone kind of keeps him around, but they also say, oh, we don't trust him. Versus in the book, Martin was very adamant about this. He was adamant about the fact that if nobody trusted Littlefinger, they would have had him killed. It was it's the fact that Littlefinger has been able to operate the way that he has because he is so he has been able to gain everyone's trust, and it was the fact that Ned legitimately did trust him. It wasn't this thing, it wasn't this thing of where this back and forth push and pull. Oh, we trust Littlefinger, we don't like Littlefinger, blah blah blah. But here, it's a matter of, okay, so we have yet another instance of Roose Bolton, rightfully so, probably the first character in the entire show, rightfully so, not trusting Littlefinger. But this obviously based off of an entire, I guess my problem with Roose Bolton's treatment towards Littlefinger is the fact that what does Roose Bolton even know about Littlefinger? But he's yet another one of a litany of characters that doesn't trust him. And also, and this is still the biggest, probably, I think possibly the biggest nitpick that I have of the entire show that really, really starts to barely rest its laurels on is, you mean to tell me Littlefinger is on Varys's level as far as knowing everything about everyone in this entire goddamn continent? And you mean to tell me he hasn't heard a single thing about Ramsay Bolton? Yeah, I guess you could make some sort of thing here of okay, because he's relatively younger. So, but it's come on, guy. Everything about everyone, and you have every single person on this entire goddamn continent mapped out to such a T, and you don't know about this one guy. I don't know. What's your take on this? I have a huge problem. That is probably my biggest problem with this entire show.
Dom, I think this storyline is, it's probably forced, I would say,
Yeah.
So basically, Littlefinger is marching Sansa towards Winterfell.
Right.
I'm going to hand you over to the Boltons.
Don't get me wrong. The motivations make sense. He knows Sansa's got something on him. He needs her out of the way, so he's going to entrust her, and while at the same time get her out of his way, while also at the same time hoodwinking her into thinking that she's going to accomplish something as far as gaining some sort of revenge against Robb Stark, which he unintentionally does do, but that's not really what he thought because he didn't think that Sansa really had it in him. So the motivations make sense, but the decision making, it's what?
Well, in her, I'll correct you real quick. I think you misspoke, but for the most part, it's he has this plan. He's now the leader of the Vale. He wants to make an alliance with the North. Because the Vale in the North will basically be a nice counterbalance to the Lannisters in the South, and it's about maintaining a lot of power. So he wants to carve out his little bit of the kingdom. He wants to have a powerful ally in the Boltons. But I just don't really think that Sansa at this point would see the logic in her sort of giving in and being traded to the Boltons.
It makes no sense.
She's probably at the most skeptical state. She's learning from Littlefinger exactly, how the game is played. And, I just fail to see how she would see some sort of personal gain by doing this. And that's what the last, few episodes to late season of season 4, she's been learning from Littlefinger is it's what do you want? And how do you play everybody? And, including your seemingly close allies. Littlefinger's almost on the nose about how he's an enemy to Sansa. But at the same time, he's a friend because of, his love for her mother. And, it's one of those things where they're playing this cat and mouse game, which immediately ends where she's just yeah, sure. I'll go marry one of the Boltons.
Right.
What? It's really, it's bizarre. I don't, there could have been more tension here where like she's forced into this relationship,
Right.
a little harder. She sort of goes with this relationship, and clearly in the seasons ahead, it's like, it's really a terrible situation. But like when Littlefinger comes back into the picture, she's relying on him and calling him, from the Vale to help with the Battle of the Bastards, and it leads to this whole weird episode where Arya and Sansa are against each other, and Littlefinger seems to be playing them.
It's set up for a whole lot of stupidity, and I'll tell you,
it's weird because Sansa at this moment that she is given to Ramsay Bolton should forever hate Littlefinger.
Yes.
And there's no way that she might utilize him, but like I think that's clear to the audience that she would just utilize him for the Knights of the Vale and nothing more. And
right.
The first chance she got to take him down, she would.
Right.
And
but then
it's
she
such
doesn't.
a transparent thing that really later on, it seems like forced or clumsy writing when it comes down to the later payoffs that happen.
And I'll add one more thing to that beautifully put argument as to why this entire thing makes no goddamn sense, which is that to me it's the ultimate betrayal of him as a character, which is Littlefinger amongst many other characters, very similar to what they do to Varys. Again, I have the same problem with Littlefinger that I do with Varys, which is where these are two characters that are set up as not being tied to anything, and so therefore are able to see everything with no bias and are able to operate so intelligently that again, they're able to see like 10 steps ahead before anything even happens, even when, again, they are forced into a compromising position, like Littlefinger forced to choose Sansa over Lysa, which in the moment made sense. But it comes down to the simple fact that from a logistical sense, forget the North, Littlefinger would be too smart to get involved in the North in any capacity because Littlefinger, again, if we're going based off the Littlefinger that we've known up to this point, not this new Littlefinger that is just acting completely rashly and making no logical decisions right there, is Littlefinger should not have the need to forge an alliance with the North because he knows that the rest of the North outside of hates the Boltons, and they're only doing it because of fear of the Lannisters, and he should know that with Tywin Lannister out of the way and the fear of the Lannisters no longer there, and even Roose Bolton himself says in this episode, the Lannister army has never once marched their army up north, not once. They can't make it past Mount Kylan. They can't survive the Trent. Their soldiers are not trained for the terrain. So he knows that the Boltons are kind of sitting ducks there for whoever's going to come, whether the rest of the North rises up against him or whether Jon does bring the wildling army south to take him again. He has no knowledge of this, but either way, Littlefinger is too smart to know to knowingly go north and try to interfere and forge an alliance with the Boltons because the Boltons do not have a longevity there. The rest of the North hates them for betraying the Starks, and they have no backup now from the Lannisters now that Tywin is dead. So his best move is staying put in the Eyrie and waiting until the Boltons are out of the way, and then revealing Sansa and using her to take control of the North, which is his plan in the books. So this entire thing makes no goddamn sense, and it only serves as a reason to get Sansa to Winterfell so that they can eventually so that they can have her be the Jane Poole substitute, jump off the parapet with Theon at the end, and then eventually have her reunite with Jon. So it is ultimately, again, them trying to set up for future storylines, but I guess unlike the rest of the storylines where they happen for the most part pretty naturally with a few plot holes, here this is just another example of them leapfrogging over logic in order to try and put characters in a certain position so that they can eventually get to the point where they need to wrap up the story. So
yeah, I think, for the most part, we've talked about it before. When you're translating from books to screen, you're going to consolidate a lot of things and combine characters and do that. And, so I understand it. I understand that's a way of streamlining things and telling the complete story from the book, but at the same time, you're changing things to fit your needs. But, ultimately, I think, without this whole storyline, we don't get sort of the very
right. It's the whole impetus. It's a crucial component of it's like an entire third of Battle of the Bastards.
Of where Sansa becomes, right? Sansa becomes the I don't, care Sansa. I don't care anymore. It's like, she finally becomes that character of like, I've been through all these hardships and you know what, this is my opinion and I know things.
Right.
And, it's one of those things where her, maybe it's sort of like the South Park, underpants gnomes, where it's like, step one, underpants, step two, question mark, step three, profit. But in this case, it's like step one, innocent Sansa, step two, question mark, step three, badass Sansa. So it's one of those things where, like, I like how her character ends in the series, but it's like how they get there. It's like, okay, whatever. Not
Yeah.
necessarily for me.
Yeah, I guess that's just the problem that I have with it, is that it's like, yeah, we already had the years of tormenting and trauma from Joffrey and King's Landing. Why do we need the re-emphasis of that in order to get us there? It's like, shouldn't she technically be at that state already? As if anything, But anyways, I digress. I've talked enough about my problems with it.
I think we're talking in
circles,
broad strokes about where the series goes, and the one thing I will say is this episode, you're right. Like you kind of brought it up at the very beginning of this podcast, is that, this is really where all the mechanisms for the storylines that go forward are really set up. And, I think they're pretty straightforward. Like if we were just to analyze this episode, it's like, okay, the House of Black and White, we get a little introduction here. We get an introduction to the High Sparrow, and, the fact that Cersei's entertaining him taking over as the religious leader in King's Landing. It's these very small seeds in this episode that sprout out to the bigger picture that we see in the seasons to come. And so I think it's effective in terms of, planting those seeds and being very short, concise, and doing everything that exactly it has to do. But ultimately, I think our biggest, my biggest takeaway from this conversation is that we're disappointed with where a lot of these storylines end up. Are just like how long they progress, or just like some of the twists and turns that.
Well, it's just because we are in the wrap-up phase, because season 5 really is the beginning of the end. Season 5 very much is the beginning of setting up for the last couple of storylines that will get us through all the way to the end. So I guess that's kind of why I keep harping it up. But let's get through the last 3 moments. And for the most part, that's kind of where my problems with this episode end, because the next 3 storylines we have for this episode are all fantastic. So I'm kind of going to fast forward through it. Brienne and Podrick, their conversation that they have, awesome. I love how it kind of continues to emphasize their relationship that they formed over the last couple of seasons. She's starting to warm up to him a little bit. She's starting to realize that he actually does have a little bit of a use. She learns a little bit about him and realizes, oh, okay, I may be able to relate to this kid a little bit more than I thought. She offers to start him training. And I will say that even though, again, it's another setup for a really, really stupid moment with her ambiguous kill of Stannis that has no reason to be ambiguous at all, their conviction there is great. It's great. It's amazingly well acted. How she utilizes the story of Renly and kind of him, giving her hope in a time period where she really had very, very little hope in her life. Kind of how they were able to relate despite Pod's, reasoning. It's like, yes, Pod, I know that he was gay. I don't care, and all that. I thought that was really, really great. And it's just, to me, it's like, it's everything that makes that character great. It's everything that makes the character of Brienne great, kind of all summed up in one conversation, which is that she is somebody who is, because of the great amount of pain that has been hoisted on her, she is somebody who is going to seek out and dole out justice to all those who would kind of, seek to, I guess, wrong somebody like that. And also it's the fact that, I think she's able to kind of translate her own personal vendetta against Stannis, into kind of this sense of justice very much so. And I think in a strange way, again, I wish that they had hinted at it more, but I think Benioff and Weiss, surprisingly enough, that was one of the few things that they were kind of able to pull out of the whole disaster that is the resolution of Stannis' arc, which is that Stannis, when he sees Brienne and understands why it is that she wants to kill him, understands kind of, and because he understands that from a sense of justice, he is able to kind of be okay with it, which, if anything, is kind of almost a redemption for Stannis at the end, almost, after everything that he's done. But that's pretty much it. I don't know if you have anything else really to add to that, but that's pretty much my take on it.
No. I think pretty much you said it all.
Yeah.
I think it's a short, sweet scene, and it basically continues our liking of Brienne and Pod, and
yes,
it just
they don't have that much to do this season, unfortunately. So next, moving on to the Wall. Once again, Aces, everything that happens here, amazing. just oh man, amazing. It's like John meeting with Stannis. What's it called? Now that he's been elected Lord Commander, him kind of turning down Stannis yet again, but Stannis also still kind of acknowledging, and respecting John by leaving the wildlings in his care.
Yeah,
as
it's
Davos
like his
says
first
afterwards.
days in the his new office, and it's just like you get to see those first moments where everything is like just perfect. Like he's making the right decisions, like he has the right support. Like there is a little setup of like half the room sort of not supporting him, another half is supporting him. But ultimately, I think for the time being, what is it, Giannis, when he refuses,
which is
to
why
take
you
his new
need
role.
the Janos Slint death there in order to justify again that like.
Well, it's even Alistair basically seems like he's going to protect
for
Giannis,
a split second,
and then he betrays him, and it's in the moment. Like Alistair doesn't really know his full positioning yet, and doesn't really have like the full support of half the men, or they really don't know how to take on John. Like they're not really setting this up in terms of a Alistair Jon Snow showdown. I think they're definitely really good at sort of letting the audience know that there is strife amongst the ranks, but at the same time they're hyping up John as this great Lord Commander, where it seems like pretty positive he's going to overcome these difficulties in terms of his surprise election to Lord Commander. And so he's going to overcome that. And, obviously towards the end of the season, we realize that, unfortunately, that doesn't pay off. But
it's the triumvirate between kind of, the three leaders that are established this season, that being Jon, Cersei, and Daenerys, which is that Daenerys is shown to be just screwing up, is shown the clear thing that she should be doing, but then just does the complete opposite. Cersei is doing what she can for kind of only motivated by self-interest, kind of makes a dumb decision and then suffers for it. Jon is seemingly making all the right decisions for the right reasons, but is also not taking into account, the thoughts and really the thought processes of his men. And as a result is kind of forced upon some consequences of it, despite him attempting to do the right thing.
I think Jon's storyline is probably the best that's happening right now.
Easily.
And it's also, it's one of those things where like he's doing the right thing. He's honoring his vows. He's probably like the best Night's Watch member, for centuries.
Probably.
That's not necessarily like, not that Lord Mormont was bad.
But Mormont definitely was a little old and definitely was kind of a little bit too forgiving and was not nearly as careful, with his men, and was a little bit too trusting towards his men, which Jon, as of right now, is not.
Yeah, like I feel like Jon, he has a bigger scope of the Night's Watch role to play in the world. Whereas Mormont, was a strong leader, but like, he didn't necessarily.
Right. He didn't have a lot of foresight.
Yeah. He just, yeah, exactly. He doesn't really know about the White Walkers or like know how to handle the White Walkers. He doesn't even get enough time to really understand that.
Right.
And I think it goes to the theory of the show where like Jon has all the best teachers, Ned Stark and Stannis and Lord Mormont and even Alistair Black or Alistair
Thorne, yeah.
Yeah, Thorne. Black is a pro wrestler apparently. Crossing the wires there.
Yeah.
But like for the most part, Jon is learning from all these characters and he has like the wisdom of them all. What Stannis would do is different from what Ned would do, which is different from Mormont and Alistair. So like he's able to sort of see these characters and these great figures, and he's able to sort of wade through and make his own mind up and make these decisions. And at the end of the day, the storyline leads to the point where he got killed for it. And
right.
Ultimately, his whole thing up until that point is, I made this vow. I have to hold this vow. The vow is until, death do us part. And when death does us part, it's like, mic drop. It's time to
That's
do
it.
what I need to do. And
Exactly.
I think we appreciate that about John's character. The fact that he tried to do it the honorable way, which is, you know, what Ned Stark did, which is what a lot of people in this show do, and it gets them killed. But obviously John has that second chance, and, you know, John, now we get to see like what happens when a character gets that second chance, and, you know, he starts to make
Yeah, he
those
becomes a
different
simp.
moves.
Yeah, he becomes
And-
a simp is what happens. But
Yeah,
well,
yeah,
I mean, we'll get to that later on. But
So-
also, can I just say too,
Yeah.
bad move on Janos Slynt's part, like way overestimating like kind of his own value and self-worth. It's like, yeah, probably
It's
a bad
great.
idea. You don't want to badmouth the newly elected Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, who also has a very, very strong reason for wanting you dead, considering the fact that you had a direct role in the betrayal of his dad. Not a good idea to just mouth off to him like
Yeah,
immediately.
and
It is
the
first
best part is
decision is
like-
acting as Lord Commander.
The best part is when he finally acquiesces, and he's just like, "Oh, I've always been afraid.
I love
just,
that.
you know."
I love that. And
then
then
it's
John
just like,
cuts off
John's
his
like,
head anyway. Oh,
it doesn't matter.
It might be the man. It's tough.
Yeah.
I gotta think, but I mean, Joffrey and Ramsay's deaths are obviously probably the two most satisfying deaths of the whole show. But I gotta say, Janos Slynt comes pretty close. Comes pretty freaking
Yeah,
close because
I think
he's just a weasel of a character. And it was kind of funny to just see character after character dunk on him after he betrayed Ned so viciously in the first season. You know, Tyrion was banishing him to the wall, and then Sam, you know, taking a shot at him last season by saying that he, you know, just, you know, all he did was hide in the larder with Gilly and the baby. I saw him in a puddle of his own making. And now, right when he's at his lowest, after he makes possibly the worst decision that he could have after a series of bad decisions, he just gets his head cut off for it. It's like,
yeah.
we're
I
not
don't think John does this, you know, out of spite or revenge or anything like that. But you know, it's one of those.
But there's
things,
definitely
like,
some satisfaction on his face there.
he gave the order and he refused. And even though this man is groveling at his feet, and, you know, in maybe a normal circumstance where this wasn't a public affair, maybe John would have basically said, "Okay, I'll mercy." But this is a public thing. This is one of his first acts as Lord Commander, and it's like he knows that he has to cement that. And so this is an act of making sure that, you know, everyone knows, like, you will follow my commands, you know, and it's punishable by death.
Right.
And so I think, you know, he makes a good leadership decision. Stannis approves it, obviously. And, you know, I think it's a great moment in this show for John. You know, it's not just like he's getting revenge or anything like that. And maybe to a certain degree, his character would come to peace with getting back at Janis for his role in earlier events. But ultimately, I think it all comes from, you know, doing what's right for the Night's Watch, you know, and you know, what he needs to do to take on the Night King in the future.
100%. Yeah. So, and then we get to the last storyline of the episode. We wrap it up with probably, to me, the best that Tyrion is in this entire season, which is, you know, easily when Tyrion and Varys stop in Volantis, which obviously results in Jorah kidnapping Tyrion at the end. Just this entire sequence, I think, from start to finish is unbelievable. Like, I was shocked because of, again, after how hard I wrote Tyrion off at the beginning of this season, I've kind of been like, you know, after kind of like the blinker you'll miss it moment that happened in the last episode, I'm like almost shocked. It's like, wow, they got this moment like 100% accurate. You know, even though, again, we don't have the Jon Connington, Aegon Targaryen subplot that Tyrion finds himself the subject of for the first half of Dance with Dragons, I still think, again, you know, him and Varys traveling to Volantis, the impetus, you know, they start off with a little bit of comedy with him, you know, saying he needs to get out of the box. And then when they're walking throughout the streets, you know, he's doing his usual bit of sarcasm and cynicism, as, you know, throughout the streets, you know, with the setup of the Red Priestesses, which I'll save that for my problem with, you know, when we get to how the Red Priests are utilized in season 6. But the big thing for me is the moment in the brothel when he's trying to seduce the prostitute, I think is just amazing. It's amazing. I'm like, wow, shit, I forgot that we could still get moments like this from Tyrion post season 4, where I think he beautifully handles it, where he seems for a moment like he's back to his usual charming self. He seduces the prostitute with literally just words, literally just words, just by recounting to her kind of all of his past experiences without really getting her in. And then the moment that he succeeds and gets what he wants, he immediately back recoils. And just, again, the acting from Dinklage in that moment is, again, it reminds him like, wow, okay, this is why we love him so much as Tyrion, because it's those little moments of like him translating across such the tragedy of this character underneath such a playful and fun and warm facade. It's like we got the sarcasm, we got the one-liner. It's like we got Tyrion back for almost a minute, and it's I don't know, it's great, man. It's unbelievable. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I thought it was a good sequence. It's one of those things where, like, I guess in terms of like where I know Tyrion's direction goes, it's one of those things where like I enjoy this sequence, but I'm sort of like, okay. Yeah. This is the end of the episode, like, whatever.
Yeah. And the whole thing is it's a big twist of where it's like you see Jorah, and they brilliantly the filmmaking too, I think, is great, where they constantly keep Jorah in the background, shrouded in shadows.
No. Oh, I think that was great.
Amazingly
like, you definitely in almost the whole sequence you see him there.
Yeah.
It's can't
great.
Miss him.
But even too, like when the camera slides and look when Tyrion's taking the piss and then the camera slides, you see Jorah right off in the background, but he's just blurred out enough. You can tell it's him, but it's just blurred out enough, right? And it's been like a decent amount of time because Jorah left in episode 8 of season 4. So like at the time, non-book readers are not sure how or where Jorah is going to come back. So like him kind of coming back this way is a little bit of a surprise for people, but it works like very, very well.
Yeah,
too.
I think 100%. Like, obviously, I think at the time of originally watching this, it's like, oh, this is good. Like, Jorah and Tyrion are finally. That's going to be the first blood that's drawn between, Westeros and Essos.
Right.
And, there's high hopes because those are both, I think, fan favorite characters at that point.
Right.
And, we're curious to see what happens.
Right.
Now, am I, being like the third time watching through the series, am I as interested in this storyline? Not necessarily, because, again, I sort of know where these stories develop, and so I'm sort of like, okay, cool, great sequence,
right.
Don't mind it, but there's a little magic loss in terms of rewatching it.
Also a little bit of a lack of ambiguity, because the whole thing is when Tyrion's kidnapped in the show, he doesn't know who's kidnapping him, because it's either because he's muffled the entire time and can't really see, and also because it's kind of kept a mystery, but also it's the fact that he doesn't necessarily know what Jorah looks like. So it's a little bit of a mystery who his captor is until he's able to figure out that it's Jorah about halfway through the journey. But we obviously, we all know who Jorah is. We know what Jorah looks like. So seeing that, again, it's more so like a little bit of a fun insert for people who've been watching the show up to that point, where they can, it's kind of when he says, the whole thing is, in the books, when he says, I'm taking you to the queen, Tyrion doesn't know who he's talking about. He thinks he's being brought to Cersei. And, because he doesn't realize who Jorah is, but us knowing who Jorah is and everything, it's a pretty easy thing for us to come to the conclusion. It's like, okay, he's taking Daenerys, and as an attempt at a peace offering. And for the most part, it's a pretty good setup. Like I said, it's a great way to end the episode. You're just like, wow, Tyrion's getting to Essos getting to Meereen a whole lot faster than he thought he was going to. So that's it. That was a recap of season 4, episode 3. Like I said, good. I think in hindsight, I was having a little bit of a hard time with my thought process of this episode, but in hindsight, I'd say good episode, not great, not amazing, but solid episode overall. It's very problematic in terms of the storylines that it set up. One glaringly obvious one with the whole Littlefinger thing, but for the most part, good episode. Not great is what I would say. I don't know if you would say the same thing.
Yeah,
Pat.
no, I think it's kind of a concise episode. I don't think there's anything like major that happens. But it does a lot of setup, and you're starting to see the wheels turn for the episodes ahead and arcs that continue for a couple seasons.
100%. So that was our recap of season 5, episode 3, High Sparrow. Like I said, if you've been listening to these on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, please be sure to keep tuning in every Friday for new episodes as we drop. Like I said, we are not stopping until we hit the finale, which we should be wrapped up with this roughly around October. If my timetables add up, we'll be back next week with season 5, episode 4, Sons of the Harpy, which I have a huge bone to pick. Huge bone to pick next week with that that episode, but we will find out next week. Follow Professor Pat with all of his social media platforms at Patrick W. Huber across all platforms.
Yeah,
Follow
on
myself.
Instagram, which I just posted on.
You posted on it?
Yeah,
Oh my God.
finally.
I
I've been
gotta
threatening
check
the
it
whole
out.
time.
Holy shit.
It's
He's finally
basically
posted, people. He finally did it.
Yeah,
Only a year after we started this, but we finally.
Yeah, so basically the television production club at Dutchess Community College, they did a live stream playing Nicktoons Unite of all things.
Let's go.
And so I posted a picture of the result, the equipment and the wires and all this stuff that my students put together to do this live stream, and a little bit of a rat's nest, but ultimately everyone had fun. They put together a decent, almost, I think it was like an hour and 45-minute stream, of them playing video games and having fun. And so, just teaching people, media technology and the picture was the aftermath. So I finally, posted something, found something that, was pretty cool, I thought. So go ahead and check it out.
Awesome. I love it. And of course, be sure to follow myself at Movie Nerd Reviews across all platforms. Be sure to follow the Talkin TV podcast at Official Talkin TV podcast across all platforms. We'll be back next week. And as always, people, 12 seasons in a short film, and watch more fucking movies. Stay frosty. See you guys next time.